Here's a hot take. Fractional HR isn't the problem. The problem is that leaders are outsourcing ownership and they're calling it their strategy. So if the culture falls apart when HR isn't full time, then HR wasn't building the culture. They were holding it together with duct tape and calendar invites. So today we're talking about the fractional fix, HR's blueprint for the gig ready culture, and whether fractional HR is the upgrade that your culture needs, or if it's that plot twist that's revealing that you never actually had one. But welcome to the Generational Edge with Kristina Green podcast, where we translate that friction at work before it starts to escalate. I'm Kristina Green, your generational translator. So excited today to have our guest Tony Ware today join us. He is the CEO and principal consultant for RevUp HR. Tony helps organizations build people first foundations that actually work in this new era of flexibility, not just look good on a slide deck. He's a cusp millennial Gen Zer leader who's seen what happens when strategy meets real humans, real bills, and real boundaries. So, Tony, thank you so much for joining us today. So happy to have you.
Thanks for having me on, Christina. Excited to be a part of the conversation.
Absolutely. So am I. All right. Well, let's just go ahead and dive right in. So, let me ask you, when you hear this term of the fractional workforce, what's the first reaction that you see from leaders on your side? Are you seeing curiosity? Are you seeing panic? Are you seeing something else?
Yeah, I really do think it depends on the leader. You're the generational translator, and so I think it depends on which leader I'm talking about. If I'm talking to a CEO who's more of that founder mentality, really knows what it looks like to build it from the ground up, the startup mentality, I think that they're a bit excited about fractional HR. I tend to see them, or workforce in general, but I tend to see them really excited about the possibility of having a strong SME at a cost that is effective, who's going to bring best practices. Because the reality is when they're coming in, they're thinking about if I'm going to have help join the team, they have to know more than me. And a lot of them are really adept in a lot of different spaces, and they want somebody who's going to elevate their team. And so I find those leaders absolutely love it. The leaders who are a little bit more worried about a fractional workforce are those who have been in house in well established organizations for, you're talking that 5, 10, 15, 30 years. And they're so used to a status quo. This is how we do things here mentality. I see those leaders really feeling like a fractional workforce will take away a lot of the control and the stability they believe that they have.
Yeah. Well, do you, because this, the interesting thing is that I can start to guess maybe the generations that may feel one way or the other there. But I'm curious to know if they're more so fearful of being pushed out, or if they're just resistant to adopting or adapting to a new way, a new opportunity, a new future that includes them. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Anecdotally, I think the ones I've run into are not necessarily as fearful about being pushed out. I think that they actually feel quite overly confident about just what they're bringing in that table, and so they're less concerned necessarily about being pushed out, but it's really that losing of control. We're I remember when I started my career, I was in a startup and I had a CEO who was butts and seats type of a guy. That was to date myself, late 2018, And so if I'm experiencing that, and that was only 7 years, 8 years ago, we're talking about individuals who have been in this environment of we see you 9 to 5, 5 days a week in office, and that's how I know that you're doing your job. And so to have someone who is fractional, who does not necessarily work your normal 8 hour day, who is not required to come into your office, and we're just basing it off of the results and metrics, well, that requires them to then, one, come up with metrics and ensure that they're actually evaluating it. But also, they have less of that visibility. So I really believe it's more of a feeling of losing control rather than a fear of being pushed out.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you on that because there's a term I use called corporate parenting is when we bring that sense of control into the environment and start to parent our teams, the individuals, even if they don't directly report to us, because the mentality is it's kind of like the old way of doing things where this is you have to pay your dues, you have to essentially run your race as long as I did, because nobody gets to the front of the line sooner than at X amount of time, right? It's more about time served than it is about actually being able to demonstrate a contribution, right? At a certain level. It is that sense of control because maybe no one can get rid of me because I have tenure here, because I have, 20, 30 years worth of experience, and someone coming fresh out of school or even another organization at another level, they don't have the experience that I do. But sometimes the mindset is so closed and recognizing that that there's a value in helping to shepherd those new ideas into the same environment, right? And I find in some of the consulting work that I've done, or contracting work actually, is when you're not a full-time employee, you are treated very differently than someone who is an employee, right? The employee, you're looking to check, or the leader is looking for them to clock in and out,
Yeah.
right? And to serve the 40 hours, right? And to go above and beyond that, when in fact actually a lot of the work, especially when you're skilled like professionals, we understand how to get a job done. It's not about the fact that it's going to take 10, 20, 30, 40 hours to do it, right? It's the value in actually completing the task.
Yeah. I couldn't agree
Yeah.
more. I think one of the things I just want to add to that is I think sometimes with some of those leaders, it's the pigeon holding the institutional knowledge as well. So they become sort of sometimes that gatekeeper of knowledge and that barrier for, and I don't want to knock certain professionals, right? But there can sometimes be in organizations that institutional knowledge barrier where it's not disseminated, let alone just with fractional workforce, but even just different levels within the organization. And so you might have that individual who, they are the stopgap from knowing how do we handle X, Y, and Z and why, and the strategy behind that. And they haven't really disseminated that information down because they're passing more so directives as opposed to giving ownership and really looking at how can we improve this.
Yeah. Well, in the past, honestly, especially at the generational level, so I'll say boomers and Gen X tend to kind of, and I'll use the word hoard, right? But to
Yeah,
hold industry knowledge, but it's also too, it's a learned practice because that's part of the toxicity that exists in the corporate environment, is that your value is based on the value that you can bring to the organization. And they also too have lived through countless layoffs and restructuring. Millennials are experiencing this. Gen Z are just now starting to experience this. But this is something that's tried and true. We already understand it. The Gen Xers and the boomers, they're used to this, so they would hoard that information because if I'm the only one who knows that, I have higher value, right?
yeah,
If I'm the only one who knows where the skeletons are buried and all of the connections to the processes, the right people to connect to in every department, then that's my value. And that is also to something that it's been perpetuated, it's been actually celebrated and almost encouraged by various leaders to do that. Instead of to train and help pass on some of that industry knowledge, they've been taught that the only loyalty there is to yourself, because
yeah.
corporations don't have that loyalty to their employees.
This is a very similar phenomena of this change that's being implemented with potentially more fractional workforce present in within organizations. I think we're seeing that pushback even just on that remote versus in person again.
Yeah.
And so of course if we're even still having that conversation, this one for sure can seem very I don't want to call it new age, but again, scary for certain individuals. If even the remote conversation is a lot.
Oh, absolutely. That we will have. I've actually have a whole other conversation around return to office mandates. And
Yeah,
I will not go on that tangent, right? But I agree. This is part of that same conversation. I'll say it's the growth in the cortex that is necessary for people to start to consider, because COVID opened up Pandora's box where different positions were never allowed to be home before or remote, that had to. That, and they
yeah.
demonstrated the value and high performance in remote work. So, okay, that's my bit on that one, my plug. Let me ask you this question. So we know that fractional roles are, they really kind of support this different understanding around more freedom, right? Which is becoming a requirement. No longer just a luxury, but having the kind of the time freedom, if you will. And in the fractional roles, because they tend to be more contracts, right? What do you think is that trade-off that organizations are having to have, leaders and teams are having to consider with fractional work?
Yeah, I think the trade-offs, pros and cons of each. Uh, and on one end, I think that organizations have a really cool opportunity to bring in some really high level talent while simultaneously dropping their overhead cost because it is a contract and it's not a W 2 employee. So they're not paying for those benefits. They're not paying for those employer taxes. And they get access to an individual who may have, like, I'll give a quick example. An HR coordinator that you're hiring in the DC area, which is where I reside, will cost you anywhere between, on the low end, 50,000 to 60,000. That's just the salary. We haven't even touched any of the benefits yet.
Mhm.
But you might be able to get a contractor who is a fractional HR director for $4,000 or $5,000 per month. And now you have access to a professional that has 10 to 15 years of experience.
Right. Right.
And I see a really awesome opportunity there because what we're seeing in the marketplace right now with job postings, and I won't get into it because it's a much bigger conversation than we need to right now. But the reality is the market is saturated with people who are looking for jobs.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, one of the things that I'm seeing in that marketplace is someone who has 10 or 15 years of experience is applying to a job that is two or three levels below them simply because they need a job.
Right.
And you're getting someone who is above that role in a lot of the qualifications, but yet it's all they could get. So ultimately, they do become unsatisfied, and they end up either leaving quickly, or they push to get a higher salary eventually, or you did settle for that person who was not quite at that level of need that you had, but you offered that salary because, hey, again, we're getting applicants, but you're not actually getting the need satisfied because the applicant is not you hired for a manager when you really needed the director.
Right.
And so I say that to say this fractional workforce gives you an opportunity to really look at what is our need and then design a budget accordingly. And sometimes that might be part time. Maybe it's fractional. Maybe it is that W 2 employee. But I think thinking more outside the box of your employment classifications that you have really potentially gives an employer and an organization an opportunity to um, really have a phenomenal workforce that just looks a little different.
Yeah.
Uh, Now, what are some of the challenges of that? Well, of course, when you're thinking about a contractor, they are not beholden to your 9 to 5. They are not necessarily beholden to being in office. In fact,
Mm-mm.
employment classifications or rather misclassifications is a really big problem right now. So if you say you have a contractor, but you're treating them as a W 2 employee, meaning you have control over how, when, and where they do their job, well, the IRS doesn't take too fondly of that because that means you need to be paying some employer taxes. And so I see sometimes they want the control of that, nature, but then you get dinged because you're treating a contractor in a way that they really shouldn't be treated. And so that is one of the challenges. If you desire that to be the way you operate your business, then I can see that being an issue for you. I think there is when you have a really cool opportunity to get really inventive with how you think about your workforce then. Which are the roles that could potentially be fractional because we don't necessarily need that 5 day a week or 3 day a week, or even if it's remote, right? Touch point of we need to know where you are, right? What are those roles that can be really performance based or project based, or you really need that strategic expertise and you have someone who's maybe the coordinator of day to day who handles that. And so you might have various different levels with different employment classification types. And then you start to see this organization that, I'm not going to lie, looks different but may actually serve your needs far greater. But there are challenges with it, right? Which is you are losing some of that control factor that you may want.
Yeah. Well, the question becomes is whether or not what's most important, um, is that whether or not we get the job done and get it done well, or that we continue to perpetuate this notion that you are responsible for creating this family-like feel, right? This team, the control over people's time and the how, right? It goes back to the control that you were saying earlier.
Yeah,
When you can relinquish the control, relinquish the how and the when, if you will, right? That the point is, because real leaders understand that the most important thing is that they provide the direction around the what. This is what needs to be executed. This is the vision. This is the strategy. This is ultimately where we're trying to go. Here is your contribution to that, right? Help them to connect those dots, to do that. And then say how you get there is entirely up to you. Whether you walk, you run, you drive, you train, you plane, doesn't matter to me, right? This is the deadline. This is the date that we're charging towards. This is and we're going to have check-ins of course along the way to make sure that, when you've got questions and I need to kind of understand more about what you're doing, but it's the relinquishing of the control. When we can do that, then fractional work, honestly, I feel like it really is the future
yeah,
across many roles. And
yeah,
oftentimes I think that HR carries this torch, if you will, or they're forced to carry the staff for monitoring and trying to create the culture of an organization. The culture of the organization is entirely dependent on all of the behaviors that you are tolerating, right?
absolutely.
And what you are encouraging, what you are rewarding, right? So who you're giving
Implicitly
performance
or
bonuses.
explicitly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Implicitly or
Oh,
explicitly. You know.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
I
No, I,
agree.
I like that. I
Mhm.
think as a HR professional, one of the keys that I see when you're talking to leadership is bridging that gap of who you believe you are or want to be as an organization versus where you actually are.
Yeah,
I think we're at this crossroads. I think COVID really presented this. COVID presented a unique opportunity for organizations and individuals to look at the world that the challenge that we all were sharing, and saying, how do we all come together to create solutions? Because guess what? None of us have dealt with this before. And we saw some really phenomenal glimpses of what can people do?
yeah,
What can people do when we band together and say, hey, the solution that we're trying to create doesn't necessarily exist? We haven't seen it modeled. How can we think strategically and innovatively on how to get there? Right? I mean, whether we see it as a full success or not, right? Like full schools going remote overnight. Implications came out of it, right?
yeah,
But
yep,
think about how phenomenal that was
right.
overnight. Our infrastructure for internet. We're like, okay, we gotta improve that, right? Now more people online.
Mhm,
we
mhm,
we saw how fast innovation can happen when we empower people. And so I say
absolutely.
that to say, every organization I hear, I don't think not one of them will say, we don't want innovative people. And yet we do then still battle this, but we want you to do it this way. And so you mentioned the, hey, what is the what? And the big piece there I'll say is, the next the next question is not necessarily how, but who's best served to do that. and that who can look very different. It can be in house, it can be fractional, but really saying this is what we need to do, and then finding the correct person to be able to get that done. And I think that's HR's job to help leaders get to that conclusion.
Mhm. I love that because the it's understanding or reshaping the misconception. You tell me if I'm wrong in this one. It's part of HR's job, at least the current reality, is to help organizational leaders to reimagine the the influence, in fact, the role of HR in the organization, right? Because historically, and I'll go back my decades before, is that historically, HR is kind of like who you go to when you have a problem with your boss. Yeah, okay. That's one small piece of it, right? And or they're the ones who get me in trouble. Like when I'm in trouble and they get added to a meeting, all of a sudden I'm in trouble, right?
Hmm.
Or a number of different things, but we never see, at least I don't think that we understood clearly before now, how strategic HR can be in helping to not only shape the success of the organization, but also to kind of help us navigate this pathway of how do we start to consider fractional work, right? Because
Yeah.
HR can be the leader in helping us to realize what that looks like.
How new that really is, I just want to put it into context that HR was an administrative, it was personnel,
Right,
right? I mean, honestly, all the way up until potentially right around COVID. And that's when HR really had that moment where it was like, hey, we really can be we always were, right? But now leaders really starting to see you as a potential partner in, strategic growth.
right,
I need your help to think about our biggest asset that we have here. Here are our goals on an organizational level. Help us from a resource perspective get there.
right,
And it became no longer about just, hey, make sure our handbook's up to date. Absolutely, still needed. We need to do that. But it also became, what are some of the policies that we can create to attract the right talent, to get the who's in the room, to support that talent to be successful? What are some of the frameworks and project management skills that we can teach these staff members to handle now a multi-state or sometimes multi-country workforce? Right. And now it's like, oh, I need that strategic thought partner there. That's within the last decade still, and so
right.
I think it's still ever evolving and growing, but it's an exciting time to be in HR.
I would, well, I'm not in HR, but I get to talk to many of people like you who are in HR, and so I continue to grow in my understanding of how I can be a voice in support of that future, right? So how can I be a partner to support you in that space? So this is Tony, this has been such an incredible conversation, and I feel like we need a part two to continue to dive on a couple of these topics. But now we're going to turn over to one of my favorite segments in the podcast where we start to decode the generation. So
Mm.
every guest that I have on chooses a word that is, I'll say, misused, overused, abused in the different organizationally, out on LinkedIn, right? And others that I've just been beat to death. And the term that you picked, I was so excited to talk about this one because I remember when I first saw this trend on TikTok and Instagram, right? It's, around demure. That's the term, demure. And it's a term that actually comes from like the 1950s. And I mean, of course, its birth is sooner than or earlier than that, but it speaks to kind of like this traditional time that many people actually seem to hold on to, right? And so I want to know what made you kind of pick this as your term. What is it doing for you? Is it rubbing you the wrong way? Is it resonating with you? Help me understand your thoughts, your position on this.
You're gonna love this. The reason I picked this term is, you mentioned my identifiers, right? So I am your youngest millennial, and I was raised by boomers, and I just hit my next decade, so I'll age myself. I'm 30, right? And I'm not on social media, like, at all. And so I get to these trends and I'm always so late. And suddenly, maybe a year, 2 years ago, I can't even tell you when it started, right? Because I'm really that out of touch with it, unfortunately. Uh, um, and everyone keeps saying it, and I'm like, please educate me. So the reason I picked this word is because I actually want to be educated today. You know,
Right.
use it in a sentence for me. Where did it come from, right? So that's actually why I picked it, because it's been popping up everywhere, and I'm always like, I have no idea what you mean.
Yeah. Yeah, well, okay, so the history of it, very briefly, is that how it relates to the corporate space, right? So I mentioned it goes back to the 1950s when really this is actually kind of rooted in understanding like a level of professionalism, or more so kind of like a pride in appearance, right? So it's how you carry yourself, how you present yourself, and how it's used in the it wasn't a term that was actively used in the corporate environment. It's kind of one of those unspoken rules in corporate, right? So we've navigated to this idea of business casual, but the corporate environment has always been suits and ties for men, and dresses, right? Dresses, long skirts, I think it's midi length, right? So it's been below the knee, and that is, I mean, there's the feminist movement and everything have influenced, the length of skirts and the wearing of pants and blah, blah, blah. But this idea of the bringing it into a recent trend, right? Especially around those who I think who share your generation, right? So the kind of the younger millennials and Gen Z, in many ways, it kind of was like, kind of like a whatever to the corporate culture. Watch me
Mm,
play in your face, right? Kind of like, well, we do a code switching, right? So I can speak corporate, no problem, right? But I can also to speak with my family. You know what I mean? So it's
yeah.
kind of a similar play on that word. Like I get it that this is what you're looking for. Let me and I think the young lady who actually first coined the term, at least on TikTok or so, she was using a kind of a makeup, right? How to look professional. But it caught on because millennials and Gen Z were also too recognizing that this was like the underbelly nonsense, right? Of like you have to, why can't I show up to work in a hoodie? I'm literally on a Zoom call, right? What's the problem
Mm,
with me wearing a hoodie if I'm getting the work done? You didn't hire me from my clothing. You hired me for what's between my ears, right? The work that I can do. And so this was kind of like tongue in cheek, if you will, right? So kind of like I'll play by your rules, but on my terms.
mm.
So so Gen
Love
Z
that.
were using this as a way to their Gen Z is absolutely using this as kind of like a code switch, right? Playing in their face, like I said. Millennials were using this to acknowledge, because they were raised believing that you don't ruin your future, right? You just play by the rules, so that way then you have a future, right? You don't, it's kind of the same reason of not getting a tattoo, because oh,
Yeah.
no one needs to see that, because tattoos were absolutely taboo, and only misfits and those who were up to no good had tattoos, right? Everyone has, well, not everyone, but most people have have tattoos these days, you know? It took me until my 40s to get my first tattoo. So, because I also too was stuck in that mindset,
That, yeah.
right? Gen X are they're side eyeing this throwback to the 50s misogyny, because they came out of this, right? They're part of the leaders, if you will, of the feminist movement. And so they started to, or at least the women started to recognize that, wait a minute, you're trying to bring us back to skirts and ties? Like, that's a no, right? And boomers are like, oh, this seems familiar. This is how I was raised, right? So they saw nothing wrong with it. It's almost like the boomers didn't understand the code switch. They didn't understand
Yeah.
that they were playing in their face. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's like it's kind of like a secret language in broad daylight. So does that make sense? Does that help you to
That makes a lot. I mean, it also really connects well to our conversation here. I think
yeah.
just on time dependence and what a fractional workforce can do. The reality is, even for our W-2 employees, it's salaried for a reason. it's, the ideal is to work a 40-hour week, but we know sometimes it'll be more, sometimes it'll be less. And so, I think the fractional workforce allows people to, have that opportunity to, hey, if it doesn't take the full 8 hours, do we do it the same way?
Right.
Do I have the flexibility as either an employee to say, I hear what you're saying. This is what we need. Here's the task. Here's how I can get it done. It might take somebody 40 hours, but we have technology. We have, we're skilled workers. It actually takes me X amount of time. Now that frees me up to do either more in your organization, and or now I can provide the same service to another organization.
Yep.
And, so it's awesome. Yeah, I love that. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. Because and I think fractional work, to bring it all right back center, is the opportunity that fractional work presents us with is the flexibility, of course, for not only for the employer, but also too for the contractor. But the greatest thing here is that it gives us the opportunity to start to think differently around our expectations, right?
Yeah.
Around our expectations around roles, around how it is that we show up. And I also too think that we need to stop thinking that, and Gen Z are really good at this because they have no dependency on making friends at work, right? Which is why they will check out all day to the pizza
Yeah.
parties or the mandatory fun. It's because they have lives and they're perfectly fine with having those lives be separate from their work. That's also too very European. Europeans,
Yeah.
they do not believe that they have to have their friendships, tied into the work that they do. Not to say that we don't have friends at work, but it means that that's not their sole. That's how corporate culture actually was born in the US, right? Is that your friends, you typically used to live around most of the people you work with,
Mhm.
so those were your friends because
Yeah.
there was no long commutes, right? Technology started to stretch the distance between your coworkers, your colleagues because of technology. So,
Hmm.
like I
Yeah.
said, I think we got a part 2 and a part 3 of this conversation, Tony.
Encore.
So, well, and let me just ask you this. Is there anything we didn't say about fractional work that I think is worth making sure that we get into this conversation? Anything we forgot?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I want to call out for fraction work is what we were ending with there. I really think it's an opportunity for organizations to think strategically about their workforce composition in general, similar to how you think about your job descriptions and what are the responsibilities and the qualifications needed. We have an opportunity when we had COVID to sit back and say, hey, which of these jobs can be done remote, have to be done remotely versus are in person. And we have a new layer here to think about, which is what is the employment classification for this role and what do we need? And I think the beauty of that new structure is I think you will, with one, the technological increases and efficiencies that we have, you as an employer can potentially save money and
Yeah,
get high value support. I think from an employee satisfaction, the ability to have, if you are a fractional worker, employment elsewhere, even if you're a full time worker and you do fractional work elsewhere, I think one of the biggest fears, and we see it in the economy right now, and I really do want to just, put prayers and positive thoughts out to those because the unemployment rate is definitely increasing now. What is happening over 2025 till now is has been devastating to many
right.
families, and what fractional work had the potential and opportunity to do. And by the way, over 35% of your Gen Z and millennials have some type of side hustle, freelance, or other work going on. And the reason being is economic safety has been shrinking. And so the ability to have multiple different incomes does help your employee to not feel like they are only beholden to that. And I'm going to just put it on a limb. Financial wellness, financial security, the feeling of being able to be autonomous of your own future is one of the biggest indicators for engagement success. And so if they're able to do their job and crush it at your job, whatever their employment classification is, and they have an opportunity to use their skills elsewhere, or again, you're using other individuals that way, I actually think you're going to have a more happy workforce, who's going to be more engaged, more productive, and thus more innovative. And so I highly encourage employers and employees to think about what is the skill set that I have and how can I utilize it in the best way possible to help organizations grow, but also create security for myself and my family.
Well, there you have it. Ladies and gentlemen, Tony has just argued the best argument I've heard for why fractional work is exactly should be part of your strategy. And I would say on the employer as well as the employee side. So if you are not considering fractional work, then I believe that you're closed-minded. If you are not considering fractional work for you as an employee, as even someone who's looking for a job, this is an opportunity. This is a pathway not only to, to job satisfaction, but also to financial and time freedom. So, Tony, this has been such an enlightening, insightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today. And so now I know that my audience is definitely going to want to connect with you. So, can you give them a little bit more about how they can find you? I'm going to put some things on the screen so that way then they'll know how to connect with you on your on LinkedIn. But go ahead and tell us
Yeah.
how do they connect with you?
Absolutely, yeah. I can be reached at for via email at Tony at RevUpHR.com. If you're a person looking for an employment, you are an employer and you need some HR help or support, please feel free to reach out via email. My cell is also 804 And then you can, of course, reach me at LinkedIn at Anthony Ware II. Look forward to hearing from you, and I'm happy to be a resource in any way possible.
I appreciate that. And oh my goodness, Tony, you gave us your cell number.
It's a work number, so we can turn it off.
I'll take it. And that QR code that you see above Tony, it will take you directly over to his LinkedIn profile. Connect with him. And if you can't find him, connect with me and I will get you connected with Tony. So Tony, thank you so much for your time again. Really appreciate it. So to every one of you out there, you've been listening to the Generational Edge with Kristina Green podcast, your generational translator. And if this episode has felt a little too familiar, it's because most workplaces are actually like this, right? Either they're considering fractional work or they're resistant to it. But this episode is intended to not just live here on this platform and where you're seeing this. Send this to someone else who you know this will resonate with, who you know needs to start having the conversation around fractional work or around the generations in the workplace. Either way, don't sit on this information, share it with someone. So send this podcast over to somebody and tell them what you thought. But if this felt a little uncomfortable, it's probably because it should, because we all have growth that we need to make on a daily basis, and starting to understand the fractional piece and how it is that we can start to approach and appreciate the contribution of others without micromanaging them, without thinking we have to control them, right? By leaning into the opportunities with fractional work, that is the work that is to be done. So until next time, thank you so much for joining me today. Tony, thank you very much for your time, and I'll see
Thanks for
you on the
having me.
next one.